guest, our colleague, Chris Brown. You're going to enjoy his talk. He's an amazing person. So without further ado, I would like to give you a short introduction. I just have one page, because there is actually several pages big. But let me just say that Dr. Chris Brown holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a PhD from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. And then he got additional studies in international relations at Oxford University. He's currently an assistant professor of computer information systems in the College of Technology and the associate director of the Center for Information Security Research and Education, which is an NSA DHS National Center of Academic Excellence. He also holds adjunct appointments in the Department of Computer Science at Rice University and the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. His research interests are diverse, but he is mostly focused in the areas of cyber geopolitics, organizational innovation, knowledge management, and intelligence studies. Prior to arriving to U of H, Dr. Brown was the Fellow for Information Technology Policy at the Baker Institute at Rice University. And before that, he worked as a software developer in a technology startup and as a foreign service officer at the U.S. State Department's Office of E-Diplomacy. Dr. Brown has published widely in the areas of cybersecurity, broadband and Wi-Fi policy, IT energy consumption, intelligence and information sharing, and computer security in the energy industry. Dr. Brown has provided commentary and opinion for a variety of news outlets, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Der Spiegel, Scientific American, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, BBC, and our own the Houston Chronicle. The list goes on, but I would like to give it a short list. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Brown.
All right, I was instructed on how these things work, and I'm going to try to avoid being the person who has trouble with slides. So one thing that isn't on my bio that BTI is probably aware of is in 2001, I received an offer to leave academia and go into government. I became an officer of the Department of State. And after spending some time in Korea, which I found very interesting, but I found the Korean language utterly impossible for me to learn, I decided to shoot for something easier, and I said I will go anywhere in the world if I can learn Spanish. I was a Spanish teacher. It seems like the right thing to do. It's a fairly manageable language. And someone in HR had a sense of humor, and of all the places in the world where Spanish is spoken, mostly here in the Western Hemisphere, but not entirely, they decided to send me to Tijuana, Mexico. And I spent 2 years, 2002 to 2004, 2003, something like that, managing the relationship between DHS and Mexico on the southern border. So I hold my tongue on this topic now. I'm still trying to forget my time in Tijuana rather than remember it. It's kind of a hard place. But on occasion that's meant that the BTI folks have reached out and said, what do you think of this? My first answer is usually, well, it's been a long time. So
Take notes for the next time I introduce you.
yeah, just keep it a secret, please. Although it's going to be a webcast or something. What I do now is primarily cybersecurity. I also am very interested in how we can use computing technology in the area of public policy. One of the new research areas that I am interested in is the social technical ramifications of artificial intelligence and machine learning in society. Keenly looking at China and how they're doing that and comparing it with what we're doing here. It's of course very different. But today I'm talking about a topic that I've been working on for the past year or so on a research project, and that is critical infrastructure. So rather than dive into the arcana of what I've been writing about, I'm going to give kind of an overview. But I'm going to start with some prognostication about the future. Because our views of the future are always right. Now, people who've taken a class with me probably have seen this picture before. And this is a picture from the RAND Corporation that they published in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I think, of what a home computer would look like in 2004. So, you know, and it's very similar to what we have at home. It's got a speaker and a monitor, and it's got a keyboard and a printer, and a steering wheel, and a gauge package, which some of you gamer PC folks are really into. But the idea was, you know, looking forward out several decades, understanding what computing would be is hard. Looking backward, is there infrastructure in our county, in our city, in our state that was built around 1960? Were there computers connected to things, you know, around 1980? Yes. And now those computers are interconnected with things. So I'm going to start out with talking about a hack. So this is the control room at a electric power utility in Ukraine. So it looks a little bit like the RAND Corporation view. But this is where your power comes from. We have a power systems group at the college. They understand this stuff backwards and forwards. I just understand that if a power system is tampered with digitally, there may be ramifications in the real world. Managing the grid is something we used to do entirely manually, but metering has changed. You know, as part of the stimulus funding in 2009, 2010, we all got electronic meters on our houses in Harris County. This communicates to a back end at our distribution utility, which is CenterPoint. And it's a complex machine that we've created. And because it is now digitized, it has an attack surface. What's an attack surface? That's the area of vulnerability on a system that someone can tamper with it. Because if we start using open protocols for communicating data from point A to point B, where we have problems is when those linkages are not entirely trustworthy or trusted. So these linkages can break. Which moves us to 2015. So December 2015, Ukraine. So is Ukraine an entirely peaceful place at the moment? No, it's not. It may not be entirely at war, but you know, this morning when I was reading my email of different news stories, and I read it every day, several emails coming in, and they say all these things. You know, I read about a new cyber attack coming out of the Luhansk region, which is a part of Ukraine that's occupied by sympathizers or nationals affiliated with Russia. Not necessarily Russians per se, but Russian Ukrainians. The east side of Ukraine is heavily populated by Russians, ethnic Russians who consider themselves more aligned to Moscow and Kiev. And what happened is, and this was during Russia and Ukraine were negotiating, even in a state of conflict, they were negotiating over things like the flow of gas across the Ukrainian state. So Russia produces an enormous amount of natural gas. Where does it go? Where's Russia's gas from? Europe. Russia is the fuel supplier that keeps Europe warm in the winter. This is something that's been going on since the 1970s, these pipelines that have spanned the European continent. And Ukraine being a waypoint of Russian pipeline activity is a problem. Does Ukraine get a royalty on its pipelines? Yes. Has it been able to pull gas off the pipelines? Yes. Can it do so illegally? Potentially. And Russia is managing this problem by building pipelines around Ukraine now. But it doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have to still deal with Ukraine on economic issues, because the export of natural gas out of Russia is one of the few areas of major export activity for the Russian state. Why am I talking about all this economic background stuff? Well, because cyber attacks don't always, or even don't usually at this point, happen in isolation. They happen now for a reason. And I will explain, you know, how this stuff works in both a technical and geopolitical sense here, because we have a vested interest in it as users of critical infrastructure. Essentially what happened is Christmas time, 2015, a cyber attack was launched against several power utilities in areas of Ukraine that were not sympathetic to Russia. Ukraine has kind of a divided network. It's not just all one company. There are companies in different regions that kind of stood up, using the old Soviet infrastructure. And some of that infrastructure was upgraded, which made it internet connected, and some of it wasn't. What happened is a multifaceted attack. The attackers used software that attacks regular old Windows computers to gain entry into power companies. Anyone who sat through my Anatomy of a Hack lecture knows everything else that happened shortly. Once they were in, what did they do? They elevated their privileges. They spanned the network. The attackers gradually assumed control of the target networks. And what their goal was to reach the computers that drive things like that control room, or that piece of infrastructure, or that nuclear power station, or that old-fashioned coal power plant. Malware spread across the grid, and even to the service points of the grid. And one of the questions that was asked to me the other day was, well, what concerns you more, a cyber attack against natural gas or electricity distribution? And I said, well, where does electricity come from in this state? Besides wind and some water and some other engines and a little bit of solar. It's coal and natural gas, and increasingly natural gas for obvious reasons. We don't need to get into the clean and dirty fuel debate today. That's not my area. I'm not going to talk about that. But, so imagine in the depths of a Ukrainian winter, the power goes out. So is that a major critical issue for this Ukrainian state? You bet. And the attack spanned these Windows machines and attacked the computers that actually do the power distribution. And these are the process control machines. And anyone who's ever been into the SCADA lab on the second floor of the technology building, you can see these things. They're just little boxes. We see them around town. They're in all sorts of places where people interact with them. In Greater Houston, these are a known type of commodity. And the Russian attack, and it took a long time for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to attribute the attack to Russia, because if it's an official attack by Russia on another country, is that a legal problem? It's a huge international affairs critical stop issue, because we really don't know at what point do you sanction someone, do you do something to harm the attacking party. So the good news for Ukraine was there were quite a few of the old gray-haired folks still around who knew how to operate the grid on manual. It's kind of no different than a good flight crew in the cockpit of a plane saying, computer's not working properly, I'm going to assume flight control, the autopilot is off, I'm going to distribute this electricity, this is how it's going to work. So the Ukrainian system was still very much able to take manual input. That's not always the case everywhere now, as we see smart grid solutions rolled out, where everything's pre-programmed. And the operators who may have the expertise in making things run on manual aren't necessarily around anymore. So, this is not the first of these types of attacks. This is kind of a more recent thing. I want to run quickly, very quickly, through a few of these. Stuxnet. Has anyone ever heard of Stuxnet? So, Haidar has heard of Stuxnet, and probably read the reporting in a couple languages on it. So, without attributing anything to anyone on a video, I will say that Stuxnet was most likely a cyber attack against the nuclear enrichment infrastructure of the Iranian state at Natanz. Natanz is a place where the Iranian government was enriching uranium to be used as a nuclear fuel and potentially could be weaponized for nuclear warheads. That's what happened in Natanz. Now, there was a cyber attack against Natanz. There were some parties that probably didn't want Iran to get the bomb, right? Maybe Israel, maybe the United States, maybe others. And the Natanz attack was a crossing of the Rubicon for cyber attack. Before this, we worried about data breaches, we worried about cyber espionage, we worried about the billions of dollars of intellectual property that's been stolen by cyber espionage. This was a real-life attack where we saw a certain kind of process controller, a Siemens process controller that's used in industrial applications all over the world, and a number of unknown vulnerabilities in Windows computer systems, something we refer to as zero days, things that were previously unknown until we find out about them. So these unknown to the general public vulnerabilities. What happened after that was an escalation of conflict that involves a larger number of players around the world who are mostly countries. So before 2010, we mostly worried about the cyber terrorism issue, that hackers one day were going to break stuff. I mean, I've tangled with the anonymous hacker collective a couple times. I found them to be mostly politically naive and technically sophisticated, but their goals were generally not to blow things up, break things, kill people. It was to embarrass folks. I mean, Anonymous is going after the Yorkshire County Council in England today over the Assange stuff. This is what we see from those kind of guys. These attacks appear to all be relating to targets that may be privately held or held by government below national governments, corporations. But the attackers have something in common, and that all the attacks here were probably largely generated by people who work for governments, what we call a nation-state cyber attack. Right after the Iran Stuxnet kind of revelation in 2010, we saw an increasing volume. Iran produces a lot of computer scientists who are very gifted, very talented. And can they be used to create cyber campaigns against targets elsewhere? Of course. The first one we saw was massive distributed denial of service against banks in the United States. This was probably in response, Iran was under sanctions at that point, where Iran couldn't be digitally plugged into the global banking system using the protocols and rules of SWIFT, which is the banking clearinghouse system for the world, basically. Banks suddenly had a harder time doing business online. I mean, what happens when you can't log into your bank website? Can you pay a bill? No, you can't. It didn't get to the level of ATMs breaking or credit card transactions not working, but it made business much harder for banks. The banks stood up and took notice, and now the largest banks in the United States, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, all have cyber operations that spend about $500 million, with a B, dollars a year on security. Because banks know they're digital, they are in the business of not putting cash on the table anymore, they're in the business of doing transactions, industry and for individuals. And this made business harder for U.S. banks. And that was countered. Things settled down. In a couple years, well, the following year, Saudi Aramco was hacked. 35,000 machines at Saudi Aramco were knocked offline for a period of about 2 weeks. And this kind of hack, where something goes onto a network, in the Saudi Aramco hack case, it was a piece of malicious software that hopped from computer to computer to computer all over Saudi Aramco and deleted all the data on 35,000 machines. This is something that will destroy a company. Not Saudi Aramco, because they got a lot of extra money, and basically Saudi Aramco's response was to call all the computer distributors in the world and say, we need 35,000 fresh computers, when can we have them? And that's what they did. They junked all their old infrastructure and built a new infrastructure in place because unlimited money. The Rybrook Dam attack, small dam. I grew up in the shadow of Rybrook. I mean, in Rye, so right down the street. I know this dam. It's not very big, but dams have control systems. What happens if a control system on a dam goes sideways? Well, if it's just holding back water, that's a problem. If it's using water to create electricity, that's a bigger problem. The Rybrook Dam was not a hydroelectric dam, but when its operators gave it instructions to open and release pressure, it didn't work. And that was frightening. There were a series of attacks on the SWIFT banking system, ostensibly by North Korea. North Korea pulled off something that never, ever has been something we thought about, except for maybe in the movies, which is robbing the U.S. Federal Reserve. You don't do a bank robbery at the Fed. It's a monetary policy institution. It's not a bank. You don't go in there and just ask for a bag to be filled. But hackers from North Korea, likely based in China, lifted money out of accounts held by the U.S. Federal Reserve for the nation of Bangladesh to the tune of, I believe, $81 million. And those transactions were being shipped off to a bank in the Philippines and then transferred into a bank in, I believe, Macau, where the money disappeared. So using kind of gray areas in the banking system. The good news is the Bangladeshis and the US Federal Reserve figured out what was going on. Most of the money went back to Bangladesh. I mean, if you're going to rob a country, Bangladesh is kind of mean. It's not exactly one of the wealthiest countries in the world anyway. But North Korea is actively engaged in cybercrime that brings North Korea money. Why? Because North Korea is under serious sanctions that don't allow hard currency to enter the country. And does North Korea like hard currency? Yes. In the last couple of years, we've had a epidemic spike in what's called ransomware. And this is software that is designed to go onto a network, touch a lot of machines, leave a footprint behind on those machines, and then when activated, ransomware encrypts critical elements of the machines, files, whatever. And I don't know, has anyone here been a victim of a ransomware attack? And did you get your money back? Or your data back, excuse me?
I just gave up on it.
You just gave up on it, you just killed the machine? Yeah, that's, corporations worth billions of dollars have done the exact same thing. So the first wave of these was and these attack code words. There's a cottage industry in coming up with code words that antivirus and security companies come up with. But WannaCry was kind of the first one of these major ransomware kind of incidents. And its most, I would say, interesting target or potentially volatile target was the UK National Health System. So unfortunately, in 2017, the British National Health System still largely ran on wait for it, Windows XP computers. Now, I can't even remember how many years Windows XP has been out of production per se, or not maintained by Microsoft. It's a long time ago now, and I just don't even remember when. But when people heard that the UK's health system was still running on antiquated computers because of underinvestment, it made a lot of people notice, and a lot of people started looking around. And unfortunately, computer systems that run critical infrastructure are largely built when the infrastructure is in place. So if you build something out in 1997 using computer systems, there is a good chance that the computer systems running that infrastructure today, 20 years later, is going to be essentially the same as when it was built. That's a problem. In IT, we look at a 3 or 5 year refresh. In critical infrastructure areas, we look at a 20 or 30-year refresher. So these are very different timetables. So WannaCry was the first one that really got a lot of attention. It was followed up by Petya, not Petya. Petya is a Russian word. Not Petya was an attempt to clarify what was what. The hacker community kind of looked at both of these things, the security community. But what NotPetya did was ransomware where if you paid the ransom, you didn't get your stuff back. And that's, folks ask me, how often do you get your stuff back if you pay? And a ransomware attack, your system will no longer be yours, and it will essentially say, you need to pay us via this mechanism, using usually Bitcoin or some other form of cryptocurrency, whichever kind you like. Oh, uh-oh. Why are we on standby? Yeah, this is not going to go on YouTube.
There's somebody hacking.
I've talked enough. Everyone should leave now. All right, so let me finish up on NotPetya. So NotPetya broke networks and corporations. Okay. So that's it.
Okay.
There we go. Got it. I will move a slide every 3 to 5 minutes from now on. That is my hope. Muller-Maersk, the data shipping concern, replaced all of its computer infrastructure in about 2 weeks. DLA Piper, one of the largest international law firms, was savaged by the NotPetya malware. DLA Piper is not an infrastructure provider, it's a law firm, but it deals with a lot of legal contracts in the infrastructure space. And then DHL, the German delivery firm, was also targeted. Were they intended? Well, no. We've seen cases where ransomware hits a company and they'll be hit up for $500. It's like, okay, you're hitting one of the Fortune 500 here. They can afford more. You haven't done your reconnaissance. But essentially with NotPetya, it was a spillover. NotPetya was something designed to delete systems information, mostly in Ukraine and other areas in the Russian kind of sphere in Eastern Europe. So fast forward to today, a couple weeks ago, there was another piece of legal proceedings. Does anyone here own cyber insurance? Are you protected against a cyber attack personally?
I don't have the assets to go out and buy it.
Yeah,
I don't need it. Well, I don't need it.
Well,
Yeah.
you can get a one-to-one kind of policy. Just pay them money, they'll pay you back and say companies do buy this stuff now. If anyone follows me on Twitter, I had a statement on it yesterday because there was there are 2 legal cases unfolding now involving NotPetya. So NotPetya was designed to attack systems in Ukraine. Does that make NotPetya a weapon of war? Well, the insurance companies thought so, and Zurich Insurance told the companies that have cyber insurance with it who were affected by NotPetya that they had been, injured in what was an act of war, harmed by an act of war, and that they weren't getting paid. It's not like the companies got blown up, but well, if you want to use cyber war to get something, to go your way, I guess that's what's going on now. And probably the most, if there's one space I really worry about in all of the critical infrastructure, I mean, obviously petroleum is, and midstream, so refinery operations. And we've had 3 major accidents in petrochemical or refining or storage in Houston in the last month. These are not good events. But in 2018, there was a cyber attack against a petrochemical facility in Al Jabal, Saudi Arabia, joint venture between Saudi Aramco and Dow Chemical, in which the safety system, this is the system which does the emergency shutoffs that reports back to a control center. These things are functioning, these aren't. That system, built by Schneider Electric of France, the Triconic system, was subverted in such a way that it no longer gave valid information about its state. That's a problem. So the Triconics hack made a lot of people notice, not least because what happens when there's a release of chemicals from a major petrochemical facility? It's extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, the nightmare scenario we deal with, and I don't like nightmare scenarios, and I don't like Cyber Pearl Harbor or any of the rest of it, but another Bhopal event anywhere on the planet would be bad. And we have to think about these problems being of cyber cause now in a way that we didn't used to. Okay, so what's critical infrastructure? This goes back to the 1990s, the Clinton administration. I think a lot of defense folks were bored the Cold War was over. And the Clinton administration started looking at the area of critical infrastructure. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of history. You can go read these things. These are bland, boring presidential directives that were aimed at the critical infrastructure problem. Fast forward to today, we have the Department of Homeland Security, which didn't exist when these initial pieces of policy were enacted, presiding over 16 sectors. Quick definition of critical infrastructure. I think we all know what critical infrastructure is, right? We know it when it's not there. When the power goes out, when the water stops flowing, when the supermarkets are empty, when planes can't take off or land. We understand these events pretty well. Today, the Department of Homeland Security has broken things down into 16 areas. Chemicals is still a serious focus. Dams is its own thing. Communications and IT are kind of fuzzy. How different is Verizon than Apple today? It's a good question. Transportation systems is everything from shipping to trucks. Government facilities now includes elections, which is a major issue, of course. For anyone who's going to the little confab we're having tomorrow with the energy group here at UH, we're having an expert come in from the nuclear reactors, materials, and waste area. Yes, people have tried to subvert systems of nuclear reactors. Does it seem like that's a bad idea? Yes, it's a terrible idea. Causing a nuclear meltdown by cyber means would be horrible. Could it happen? Possibly. So, the good news is the government is on it. CISA, who Bobby and I met their chief a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C., is the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, cyber and infrastructure, which means they cover cyber infrastructure. This is a critical public policy issue because, CenterPoint's a big electric company, right? Now, if you live in a rural area in West Texas, CenterPoint doesn't give you your electricity. A rural power authority probably does. It might have 500 customers. How are they protected? And how do they manage these problems? This is something that the legislator worked with us a couple years ago on. Bobby, how many billets were empty at CISA? Do you remember?
Too many.
Many.
Yeah.
Their assistant secretary said to me 560 open jobs. So not 25 people, not 50 people. They have to staff an entire agency with cyber experts. Those experts don't exist. And unfortunately, they don't usually want to work for government salary. Now, it's good that CISA's out there. It's good the Department of Homeland Security has finally, I think, elevated this issue to a point where it's its own agency. It's something that has its identity. It's not just some function buried deep down inside DHS. Now here's the other part. CISA has to work with U.S. Cyber Command because U.S. Cyber Command, which is part of the Department of Defense, has declared that it will be responsible for protecting U.S. critical infrastructure from military attack. 85% of critical infrastructure is owned in the private sector. So if there's a cyber attack, does that mean the Marines show up at your company? We haven't seen it yet. Could it happen? Yes. If you're bringing Cyber Command along, well, the person who's in charge of Cyber Command is also in charge of another agency. What is it? The National Security Agency, which is the United States government's signals intelligence agency, which is now an intelligence service that's responsible for collecting data for terrorist attacks, potential terrorist attacks, or espionage undertaken by adversaries to the United States. It's a straight up intelligence service. And Cyber Command and the NSA are commanded by the same person, and they are working with CISA on the critical infrastructure problem. Which means that if there's an intelligence agency involved, you have to have the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence involved. And that person, Senator Coates, has their own cyber agency underneath their org chart that they have to be involved. And whenever anything illegal happens, you have to call the FBI. But when you want to do a prosecution, you have to call the Department of Justice. The FBI has to work with them. And just in the business of making sure that things are up to snuff and properly operating, you have other sector coordinators that are involved. The Department of Commerce, because infrastructure is infrastructure commercial activity, yes, I mean I pay my power bill too. The Department of Commerce has a whole operation run at the National Institute of Standards and Technology on security that is pushed out to companies that CISA is designed to protect. In addition to that, they also oversee a lot of the commercial activity that was the making of the internet. Because we worry about energy attacks, the Department of Energy is involved. Cyber attacks against the energy infrastructure, whether it's pumping of oil or transshipment of gas. Oh wait, that's not right. We'll get to that in a second. Department of Energy has to figure that out. And then this banking stuff, you've got the Treasury Department. They have to be involved. And the Secret Service used to have a cyber wing under Treasury, but when Treasury got the Secret Service moved to DHS, that went away. So there have been reorganizations in this process year after year now for almost 20 years. And then finally the Department of Transportation is involved because moving gas to a power plant is not the responsibility of the U.S. Department of Energy as far as oversight. It's the Department of Transportation because you're transporting the gas, you're not burning it or making it or refining it. So this is the kind of policy space in which all this stuff has to come from. It's an interagency that involves all of these agencies in Washington that have to drill down to the rest of the world, and as far as all of the other U.S. actors in this space, in establishing things like standards, guidelines, regulations, frameworks. And unfortunately, my latest trip to Washington bears it out. Washington hasn't met a framework or standard that it doesn't want to promote. The problem is, you can promote a standard or framework inside the Department of Energy, and then the Department of Commerce will ask you to go do the same thing again and do it differently the way they like. This makes this kind of concept of a well-organized unitary response very hard. Okay. So 80 to 85% of the government is involved in infrastructure. This is the policy prescription part of what should we do. And this is where, as academics, we start looking for research areas. One of the things that I've gotten involved in my career over the last couple of decades is information sharing. Information sounds good, right? And sharing it sounds good. Does the government share information well? Is classified information something that moves freely around the world? Well, thanks to Julia Assange, maybe. But my point is that information sharing is incredibly hard to do. Do companies want to give the US government data about their operations? No, of course they don't. They don't want to be open to potential, like I said, there's a map up there. If a company shares information with DHS and then the Department of Justice sees that there's something not right, it comes from that information sharing, can that hurt a company? Yes, they don't want to do this. They don't want to get caught up in the works. So information sharing of indicators has been one of the paramount issues here. Vulnerability assessments. This is something that companies don't really have time to do. The smaller ones don't have the money to do. And in infrastructure, here's the real issue. If I want to scan my computer for viruses, does that affect my computer? It slows it down. Does my computer still work? Can I still do email while my computer is being virus checked? Can I scan the computers at ExxonMobil's refinery in Baytown while it's making petroleum products? No. If I monkey with computers that are involved in this kind of activity in any way, shape, or form, when they're operating, I can send that computer into an operational state that could in some way affect the operation of the facility and cause it to have an emergency shutdown. And we had a lot of emergency shutdowns during Harvey. They produce a lot of ancillary effects that we don't like to think about, but are real, which include release of material into the atmosphere. So vulnerability assessments are hard. You have to go in at the right time and say, okay, we know you're fixing part of your plant. We're also going to look at the cyber side now. And when your plant is fixed, we have to leave. So we're on a deadline right now. Tools and resources. One of the great things the government can do is spend money on making tools. How many people here use Tor, the onion router? Nobody here uses Tor? Nobody? Okay, Denise uses Tor. She should. So Tor is an anonymization platform that was created not by Google, not by the Apache Foundation, which now manages it. No, it was created by the Office of Naval Research because the Navy wanted to know that it could look at websites around the web and not have traced back to it that they were looking at websites. I know that probably indicates that the Navy has a porn problem. That's not